The first time humanity met the Cathar, they weren't the conquering warriors the outer colonies had whispered about. They weren't the silver-clad emissaries of some radiant empire. They arrived in a convoy of shattered ships, hulls scorched, engines sputtering, life support failing. Entire generations of their kind were huddled inside, eyes sunken, minds fraying. They weren't running from war. They were running from something worse. They begged for sanctuary, not in the language of prideful sovereigns, but in the universal cry of the hunted, "Help us, please." And against the advice of half the United Earth Directorate, we opened our gates. Before we continue, please like and subscribe, because this story is not about weapons, not about fleets or fortresses. It's about scars, and how sometimes the things we survive become the strongest walls we can build. The Cathar were a people sculpted by beauty. Their minds, when we first touched them, were crystalline, perfect, unblemished, flowing with harmony. They had no word for trauma, no concept of nightmares that linger, no shared memory of firestorms or extinctions. Their civilization was an unbroken glass surface, smooth and untouched by the rough hands of grief, which made them the perfect prey. The thing chasing them, what they called the Maw, was not a creature in the physical sense. It was something older, something that didn't hunt bodies but souls. It fed on agony. It burrowed into thoughts, unspooled memories, gnawed at pain until nothing remained but shards, and when it touched the Cathar, their beautiful minds shattered. A glass pane meeting a hammer. Dozens of their colonies had already fallen, entire fleets dissolved into madness before a single weapon was fired. The Cathar were being unmade from the inside out, and so, desperate, they turned to us. The tribunal debates lasted weeks. Some worlds argued we couldn't afford to take in millions of fragile aliens. Others said humanity itself wasn't ready. We were still crawling from the ash of our own dark centuries. But one man stood before the chamber and made the case that would seal our fate. His name was Daniel Armitage. To the Directorate he was a diplomat. To veterans of the Mars insurgency he was a soldier with a scar running from temple to jaw, a man who had once carried broken bodies through dust storms because he refused to leave them behind. To his friends, few though they were, he was a man who drank more than he should, who spoke little of the wife and child he had buried beneath Europa's ice. When Armitage spoke, his voice didn't carry like thunder. It was quiet, almost conversational, but every delegate listened. "They came to us broken," he said, "and if there's one thing humanity understands, it's what it means to be broken. We know the taste of ash. We know what it means to bury the people we love. We've stared into our own abyss and crawled back out with the scars to prove it. And maybe, just maybe, that's why we're the only ones who can stand beside them now." It wasn't the speech of a conqueror. It was the weary honesty of a man who had already lived through the fire. And that was enough. The gates opened. The Cathar came to Earth. At first, they marveled at us. Not at our technology. It was primitive compared to theirs. Not at our fleets. They were scattered and barely unified. But at us. They saw the scars on our streets. Cities rebuilt on the bones of older cities. Families carrying photo albums of those lost in wars long past. Soldiers who laughed despite prosthetic limbs, who told jokes at funerals, who carried the weight of ghosts without collapsing. To the Cathar, it was unthinkable. They whispered among themselves, how do they still stand? How do they not shatter? That was when Armitage stepped forward again. He wasn't a scientist. He wasn't a psychic theorist. He was simply the one human they trusted to answer their question, and so he told them the truth. "We don't avoid the break," he said. "We break, and then we heal. And when the wound heals, it leaves behind scar tissue, ugly maybe, but tougher than what was there before. Every scar tells us, you survived, you endured. And if the Maw comes for us, it'll learn the same thing every nightmare in our history has learned." He looked at the Cathar delegation, their glassy eyes full of fear. You can shatter glass, but you can't break a scar. But the Cathar didn't believe him. Not really. And when the Moor's shadow finally stretched across Sul, when its whispers crawled across the edges of our system, the Cathar begged Armitage not to face it. "It will devour you," they said. "It will peel away your mind until nothing remains. You are fragile flesh, Daniel Armitage. No scar can save you." Armitage only smiled, though there was no joy in it. Let it try. The first contact took place aboard a containment vessel stationed between Mars and Jupiter. Armitage stood alone inside a chamber woven with psychic dampers. Around him, glass walls separated him from rows of Cathar observers and human scientists. Beyond them, the Moor coiled, an invisible storm pressing against the boundaries of thought itself. The Cathar hissed and trembled. Even filtered through meters of shielding, its whispers crawled into their minds, promising pain, unmaking. But Armitage stepped forward. He closed his eyes, and he invited it in. What happened next would be recorded in every archive of the galaxy. The Moor surged into him, a tidal wave of anguish and hunger. It clawed at his memories, gnawed at his grief. It dragged him back into the burning streets of Mars, the scream of his squad when the airlock ruptured, the sight of his wife's hand vanishing beneath Europa's ice. The Cathar pressed against the glass, watching in horror as the human's body convulsed. Surely he would break. Surely his mind would fracture like theirs. But then something strange happened. He didn't break. He endured. The Moor screamed inside him, feeding on wound after wound, but each wound was closed with scar tissue too thick to pierce. It tasted sorrow, but instead of unraveling, it found itself trapped, caught in an endless labyrinth of healed pain, of strength born from survival. And then, impossibly, it recoiled. That was the moment the galaxy began to understand the scarification principle. Not that humans were immune to pain, not that we were unbreakable, but that we were the only species who had learned to live with the break, to grow around it, to harden where we had been cut open before. Daniel Armitage opened his eyes, blood trickling from his nose, his breath ragged. "Is that all?" he whispered. The Moor shrieked, not in triumph, but in fear. The first contact chamber trembled as the Moor pressed against its edges, a pressure without form, a storm of whispers clawing at the minds of everyone within 100 kilometers. Even with layered dampers, the Cathar convulsed, their crystalline thought structures cracking beneath the psychic tide. Some collapsed, others hissed warnings in their fluid melodic tongue. But Armitage stood motionless. He closed his eyes, and the storm entered. The Moor poured itself into him like molten iron through fractured stone. It found grief first, the easiest entry. His daughter's laughter, frozen forever in his memory, shattering into the scream he hadn't been fast enough to silence, the ice of Europa closing over her body while he pounded helpless fists against the glass. It devoured that moment eagerly. It sank claws into his guilt and pulled. But as it did, it hit something unexpected. The memory bled, yes, but around it was a wall, hard and knotted, a scar that did not yield. Armitage had replayed that moment so many times in his own mind that grief had calcified into something else. Endurance. It couldn't be consumed because it had already been survived. The Moor shrieked. The Cathar saw it, not with eyes, but with the fragments of their minds. They saw the human's grief ripple outward, not as a wound, but as a fortress. They felt the texture of scar tissue, ugly yet immovable, a kind of psychic steel born of pain. For them, trauma was a death sentence. For him, it was a weapon. Armitage gasped and swayed. Blood traced a line from his ear. Still, he whispered, "You're not the first nightmare I've met." The Moor recoiled. Then it struck harder. It dredged up Mars, Armitage running through streets on fire, lungs burning from red dust and smoke. He had carried comrades until his arms broke, watched friends' faces vanish into collapsing tunnels. It shoved those moments at him, magnified them, tried to peel them open like wounds. But again, it struck scar. Yes, the streets had burned. Yes, the screams had echoed, but he had already lived through them. He had already survived. The wound was sealed with calloused strength. It fed, but it starved. The human scientists outside watched the monitors spike, then plateau. Armitage's vitals dipped but stabilized. His brainwaves rippled with impossible resilience. "Impossible," whispered Dr. Havelock, head of the project. It should have shredded him. The Cathar beside her trembled. "No, it is shredding, but the flesh grows back faster than it can cut. They are not fragile. They are scar upon scar." The Moor did not relent. It pressed deeper, past grief and war, down into marrow. It found shame, rage, self-loathing nights Armitage had drowned in drink to forget. It bared every flaw he had ever tried to bury. And it lunged. Armitage collapsed to his knees, his chest convulsed. For a moment the monitors screamed red. The Cathar covered their eyes. They could not bear it. But then Armitage laughed. It was ragged, bitter, but laughter all the same. "You think you're showing me something new?" His voice cracked, but his words cut through the chamber. "I live with this every damn day. You think you can break me with what I've already survived?" He lifted his head, eyes bloodshot, a soldier's stare boring into the unseen storm. "Try harder." The Moor faltered. For the first time in its endless existence, it tasted resistance, not from walls, but from scars. Fortresses made of things it could not digest. It was like gnawing on stone. And it did not understand. Outside the chamber, Cathar observers whispered among themselves. Some wept openly. "They let their wounds remain," one said in disbelief. "They carry their pain instead of discarding it. They build with it." Another hissed back, "Madness! Survival through madness!" But even as they argued, they saw the truth. The Moor was recoiling. Its edges frayed. Its whispers grew shrill. It was the predator, yet here it was, the one bleeding. Still, it refused to retreat. It coiled tighter, compressing into a single blade of psychic force, and drove itself into Armitage's deepest wound. The night his wife had begged him not to take the Europa assignment. Her last words, her last smile, the unspoken regret. It forced him to relive it in endless loops. Armitage's body shook violently. His hand clawed the floor. His breath hitched in ragged gasps. But then he whispered her name, not in grief, not in agony, but with reverence. His lips curled faintly into something between sorrow and love. And the loop broke. The Moor reeled back, keening. This was impossible. This was poison. This was hope, buried beneath grief, woven into scar. Armitage pushed himself upright, trembling but unbroken. "You don't get to win here," he rasped, "because everything you take from me is already carved into stone. You can't break what's already scarred over. You can only learn what it means to fail." The Moor shrieked, its psychic scream echoing across the chamber. Glass fractured, lights flickered, the containment vessel groaned, and then silence. It withdrew, not destroyed, not slain, but broken, its hunger thwarted, its dominance undone. The Cathar collapsed, trembling. Some sobbed, others bowed their heads. Daniel Armitage staggered out of the chamber, bloodied, shaking, but alive. His gaze swept the stunned crowd. "This is what it means to be human," he said softly. "We scar, and we endure." But that was only the first battle, because the Moor had felt something inside him it had never encountered before. Not just grief, not just scar tissue, but something brighter, something dangerous. And it wanted more. The Moor did not vanish into the void. It lingered. Days after the first contact, the solar system itself seemed quieter, like the air before a storm. Communications jittered with phantom echoes. Dreams were plagued by whispers. Ships passing the outer rim reported shadows that weren't there. It wasn't retreating. It was watching. Armitage spent those days confined to a medbay orbiting Luna. His body was stitched with tubes, his mind prodded by scanners. Every report showed the same thing. Damage, yes, but also resilience. His neural pathways had rerouted themselves around psychic trauma in real time, like scar tissue knitting inside the brain. Dr. Havelock studied the results until her hands shook. "This isn't survival," she whispered to her staff. "This is adaptation. His mind is learning how to scar faster." The Cathar delegation hovered in the chamber beyond, their luminous eyes fixed on the human who had stood against their nightmare. Some worshipped him already. Others feared what his existence meant. Armitage, for his part, hated the attention. He lay awake through the long artificial nights, staring at the ceiling. He saw his daughter's face, his wife's last smile. They had not vanished. The Maw hadn't erased them. If anything, they burned brighter now, etched deeper into him, and he wondered if that was a blessing or a curse. When the Maw returned, it did not come quietly. It descended not on Armitage's chamber, but on the entire fleet stationed near Saturn. Ships went dark in waves. Crew collapsed, screaming. The entity was no longer testing. It was feeding. The Cathar screamed in collective terror. "It grows desperate," their seer voices quavered. "It knows you can resist. It must consume before it breaks." Human admirals demanded weapons. They readied railguns and antimatter warheads, desperate to fight something they couldn't see. But all the firepower in the system was useless against whispers in the mind. There was only one option: Armitage. They found him half-dressed, pale from the medbay, fury in his eyes. He didn't argue. He didn't hesitate. He only asked one question. Where? Within hours, he was aboard a command vessel, hurtling towards Saturn's storm-racked orbit. The Maw's presence was already coiling there, thick as gravity, pulling minds into its abyss. The closer they came, the more the crew suffered. Nosebleeds, seizures, catatonia. But Armitage stood at the bridge window, jaw tight. "You're done hiding," he muttered. The second confrontation was not inside a chamber. It was everywhere. The Maw poured itself across the ship, an ocean of shrieking memory. The crew collapsed one by one. Only Armitage remained standing. He welcomed it in, and once again it tried to break him. It showed him Earth burning, cities drowned, skies blackened, humanity extinguished in every way imaginable. It forced him to hear his daughter scream in voices not her own. It painted his failures across the stars. But where others would have broken, Armitage leaned into it. "Yes," he whispered through gritted teeth. "I've imagined all of this. I've lived through worse. You're only echoing what I already carry." The Maw recoiled, confused. It was supposed to devour. But this man consumed it. Every horror it conjured became scar tissue, another layer on the wall. And beneath those scars, something pulsed. Not just survival, not just endurance, but defiance. The Cathar, watching remotely, saw what no one else could. The human's mind glowing in the storm, a fortress of wounds lit from within. "He does not merely endure," one whispered in awe. "He teaches his pain to fight for him." Another hissed in fear. No being should wield their scars as weapons. But the truth was undeniable. The Maw was fracturing. Its whispers grew ragged, hollow, desperate. Armitage fell to his knees. His body shook with the effort of holding it all. Blood slicked his lips. His heart stuttered. But his mind burned like iron. "You wanted to feed," he rasped, every word a blade. "So feed. Take it all. And choke." The Maw obeyed. It lunged, devouring everything he offered. Grief, rage, shame, guilt. It swallowed until it drowned in the endless ocean of scars. And then something broke. Not in him. In it. Across Saturn's orbit, silence swept the fleet. The whispers ceased, the psychic pressure lifted. Ships powered back to life. The Moor's presence was gone. Not destroyed, perhaps, but shattered, bleeding, fleeing into the dark between stars. Armitage collapsed fully, unconscious, his body racked but his mind intact. When he awoke 3 days later, the Cathar delegation stood at his bedside. They bowed, not in ceremony, but in something closer to surrender. "You are not prey," their leader said softly. "You are scar, and scars do not break." Armitage looked at them, eyes hollow but steady. "No," he said, "but they never stop hurting." The story spread across 2 civilizations. Humanity, once dismissed as fractured and chaotic, became something more. The species that endured, the scarred ones, the unbreakable. And somewhere in the dark, the Moor licked its wounds, whispering. It had tasted something it had never known before, not just pain, not just grief, but hope.